you cannot see. The July sun has been swallowed by darkness. The only thing telling you where the enemy is standing comes from the sound of 14,000 voices screaming for blood. Mud grips your boots like a corpse, refusing to let go. Your shield is splintering. Somewhere in the blackness, a king is dying. This is the Battle of Stiklestad, July 29th, 1030. A total solar eclipse has transformed the Norwegian valley into a pit of shadow, and in that shadow, a mob of farmers is tearing the crowned ruler of Norway limb from limb. The violence here has no elegance. There are no cavalry charges across sunlit fields. There are no arrows arcing gracefully through clear skies. This is hand-to-hand butchery, conducted in complete blindness. King Olaf Haraldsson, the man who claimed to rule by divine mandate, is surrounded by a wall of enemies pressing inward from every direction. He swings his sword at shapes he cannot identify, slipping on the entrails of men who swore to protect him. The army facing him is called the Bondetogo, the peasant host. These are not professional soldiers. They have no matching uniforms, no regimental discipline. They carry wood-cutting axes, boar-hunting spears, and skinning knives sharpened on barn stones. They have marched here from their farms with a single savage objective: regicide. They do not want to capture Olaf. They want to erase him from the face of the earth. The sheer mass of attackers is crushing the king's defensive formation. His hired mercenaries, men who have fought across the Baltic and the North Sea, are being trampled into the bloody grass. Every time Olaf cuts down one attacker, 3 more surge forward from the void to replace the fallen. The eclipse has stripped away all military order. What remains is a chaotic collision of bodies in the muck. But here is the question that separates history from mythology. Why? Why are common farmers, men who tend sheep and harvest barley, throwing themselves onto a king's blade? Peasants do not normally hunt monarchs. They fear them. They bow to them. They pay taxes to them. The men charging up this hillside are not motivated by fear. They are motivated by hatred, a deep generational hatred for the man who promised them salvation, but delivered only suffering. To understand this suicidal assault, we must forget the Saint Olaf that later centuries would venerate. We must examine the man holding the blood-slicked sword. Before the church canonized him, before the miracles and the golden shrines, Olaf Haraldsson was a ruthless Viking raider. He did not learn leadership in a monastery. He learned it burning villages along the coastlines of England and France. The man dying in the eclipse darkness is not a martyr, not yet. He is a warlord reaping the harvest of everything he planted. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button before we begin fully into this history. 16 years before Olaf bled out in the mud of Stiklestad, he was already flirting with death. But the setting was radically different. Replace the dark Norwegian valley with the grey, churning waters of the River Thames. The year is 1014. Viking Age history has reached a violent crescendo. England is a battleground. The Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard has recently died, and the English king Ethelred is desperately trying to reclaim his throne from the Danish occupation. But standing between Ethelred and victory is the fortified London Bridge. This was not the stone tourist landmark that stands today. The London Bridge of 1014 was a wooden fortress spanning the Thames, bristling with Danish defenders. Soldiers lined the parapets, hurling spears and dropping boulders onto any vessel foolish enough to approach. The bridge was a choke point, and the Danes controlled it absolutely. Enter Olaf Haraldsson. He is approximately 19 years old, a stocky, thick-necked mercenary captain with a reputation for unconventional violence. King Ethelred offers him a fortune in silver to break the Danish stranglehold on the city. A conventional commander might have attempted to storm the bridge from the riverbanks. Olaf chose a different approach. He decided to bring the bridge down into the water itself. This operation demonstrates the brutal ingenuity of Viking-era military engineering. Olaf ordered his men to strip the roofs from nearby houses and warehouses. They lashed wattle, wicker, and timber over their longships, creating crude armored shells, floating siege engines designed to absorb punishment from above. The fleet rode directly into the kill zone. From the bridge, the Danish garrison unleashed chaos. Heavy stones crashed through the wicker roofing. Spears pinned oarsmen to their benches. The noise was overwhelming. The cracking of timber, the screaming of wounded men, the roar of the river current. But the ships survived long enough to reach the massive wooden pilings that supported the bridge's central span. Olaf did not order his men to climb up and fight. He ordered them to row away. Thick cables had been wrapped around the support pillars. Olaf gave the command. The oars bit into the Thames. The current added its force to hundreds of rowing Vikings. The ropes pulled taut. The wooden pilings groaned under impossible tension. Above, the Danish defenders felt the ground shift beneath their feet. With a catastrophic crack, the structural supports failed. The main spans of London Bridge buckled and collapsed into the river, dragging hundreds of armoured soldiers to their deaths in the muddy waters below. The blockade was broken. London fell to Ethelred, and if that sequence of events sounds familiar, historians believe it may be the grim origin of the nursery rhyme London Bridge is falling down. This was Olaf Haraldsson at his most effective, not as a pious leader contemplating divine mysteries, but as a weapon for hire. He spent his adolescence terrorizing the coastlines of the Baltic. He was nearly killed in Estonia. He raided Finland. He burned settlements in Normandy and France. By the time he reached 20 years of age, he had witnessed more bloodshed than most people encounter in several lifetimes. His motivation during these years was not religious conviction, was silver. He participated in the extraction of the Danegeld, the massive protection payments that English kings paid to make the Vikings go away. This was organized extortion on an international scale. You paid the Northmen to leave, and they used that money to build better ships and return demanding more. Piracy has a ceiling. You can only burn so many villages before you start wanting a kingdom of your own. While wintering in Normandy, surrounded by the wealth of Duke Richard II, Olaf began to look northward. He saw his homeland, Norway, fractured and weak, controlled by petty chieftains and foreign Danish proxies. He saw a power vacuum waiting to be filled. He also observed something in Normandy that would become his most powerful weapon: the church. The Dukes of Normandy were themselves descendants of Vikings who had converted to Christianity, and Olaf noticed how politically useful this foreign god could be. The old Norse paganism was chaotic, decentralized, and personal. Every valley had its own sacred grove, its own traditions, its own interpretation of the gods. There was no central authority. Christianity operated differently. It was hierarchical. It placed a king of kings at the apex, with earthly monarchs serving as his representatives. It was a religion of order, obedience, and divine right. For an ambitious man, Jesus Christ was not merely a savior of souls. He was the ultimate political tool. Olaf understood that if he wanted to unite Norway, he could not simply be another warlord fighting for territory. He needed to be God's chosen warlord. He washed the blood of the Thames from his hands, accepted baptism in Rouen, and set his sails toward home. The pirate was returning to claim his crown. When Olaf landed in Norway in 1015, he did not kiss the ground in pious gratitude. He conquered it. He declared himself king, but a title is meaningless without submission, and submission required force. What followed was one of the most brutal cultural transformations in medieval European history, the forced Christianization of Scandinavia. Olaf decided that if his people would not kneel willingly for salvation, they would kneel with shattered legs. For the independent farmers and regional chieftains of Norway, this was not simply a change in religious practice. It was a hostile takeover of their entire way of life. The old faith, the worship of Thor, Odin, and the ancestral spirits, was woven into every aspect of existence. It governed planting seasons, legal disputes, marriage customs, and burial rites. The local chieftains, known as jarls, were effectively petty kings in their own territories. They sacrificed to their own gods and enforced their own laws. They answered to no distant monarch. Olaf intended to demolish that autonomy entirely. He viewed himself as the Rex Perpetuus, the eternal representative of Christ on Norwegian soil. To resist the king was to resist God himself, and the penalty for both was destruction. He traveled from valley to valley with his armed retinue, summoning the local farmers to the thing, the traditional legislative assembly. The offer he presented was brutally simple: accept baptism or face consequences. The consequences were calculated for maximum terror. The saga sources record that those who refused conversion were not merely fined or imprisoned. They were blinded. Their tongues were cut out. Their farmsteads were burned to bare rock. Entire families were driven into the wilderness to starve. One confrontation in particular captures this collision of civilizations. It occurred in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley against a powerful local chieftain named Dale Gudbrand. The chieftain challenged Olaf directly, demanding to know why this invisible foreign god deserved worship when their own deity, a towering wooden statue of Thor, magnificent and terrifying with its raised hammer, stood right before them. Olaf proposed that they settle the matter at sunrise. The following morning, as the sun crested the mountain peaks, Olaf pointed toward the eastern light and shouted to the assembled crowd, "Look, there is my god approaching." As the peasants turned toward the sunrise, one of Olaf's warriors, a giant named Kolbein the Strong, stepped up to the idol of Thor. With a single devastating blow of his iron-banded club, he shattered the statue into fragments. No divine lightning struck him down. Instead, according to the saga accounts, mice, lizards, and snakes poured from the hollow interior of the idol, scrambling over the horrified onlookers. The great god was nothing but rotting wood, infested with vermin. Olaf turned to the stunned assembly and delivered his ultimatum. "Choose now, gold for the king and baptism for Christ, or we settle this with steel." The valley converted immediately, but this approach carried a cost that Olaf failed to calculate. While smashing idols terrified common farmers, it enraged the powerful men who controlled Norway's resources. Chieftains like Thorhund and Kalv Arnesson watched as their ancient privileges were stripped away. They saw Olaf not as a holy reformer, but as a tyrant exploiting a foreign religion to seize absolute power. Every tongue Olaf ordered removed created a family sworn to vengeance. Every sacred grove he burned deepened the well of resentment. Olaf was constructing a unified Norway, yes, but he was constructing it on a foundation of terror. And terror is a brittle material. Apply enough pressure, and it does not bend. It shatters. By the late 1020s, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The enemies Olaf had created were searching for a way to destroy him. They needed only a sponsor, wealthy enough to fund the revolution. While Olaf was manufacturing enemies in every Norwegian valley, a vast shadow was lengthening across the North Sea. It belonged to Cnut the Great, the most powerful monarch in northern Europe. If Olaf was a hammer, Cnut was a surgeon's blade. By 1028, Cnut ruled an enormous maritime empire encompassing England, Denmark, and portions of Sweden. His treasury overflowed with revenue extracted from England, the wealthiest kingdom in the Western world. And Cnut had fixed his ambition on the Norwegian throne. He understood something that Olaf had missed entirely. It is far cheaper to purchase a man's loyalty than to kill him. Cnut launched a campaign of silent conquest. His ships began arriving in Norwegian fjords, but they carried no berserker warriors. They carried chests of English silver. His agents whispered into the ears of discontented chieftains, men like Thorhund and Kalv Arnesson, who were already burning with resentment toward Olaf's tyranny. The message was elegantly simple. Why serve a king who mutilates your kinsmen and confiscates your property when you could serve a distant emperor who pays you handsomely and allows you to govern your own lands as you see fit? The effect was devastating. Olaf's support evaporated. When Cnut finally sailed his fleet to Norway in 1028, he did not have to fight a single significant engagement. The chieftains simply changed allegiances. They rowed out to meet his ships, not to attack, but to kneel. This is the cold mathematics of political power. Olaf had attempted to rule through fear alone, but fear requires constant pressure to maintain. The moment a better offer materialized, the entire structure collapsed. Isolated and outnumbered, Olaf recognized that the situation was hopeless. He could not fight the richest monarch in Europe and his own rebellious subjects simultaneously. In a humiliation that must have burned deeper than any sword wound, the Viking king fled his own country. He took his young son Magnus, a handful of loyal followers, and escaped eastward across the Baltic Sea into the frozen vastness of Russia. The tyrant had been deposed without a single drop of blood on Norwegian snow. But Cnut had made one critical error. He allowed Olaf to escape alive, and a wounded predator, cornered with nothing remaining to lose, is the most dangerous creature in existence. Olaf fled east, following the river routes that Swedish Vikings had pioneered centuries earlier. He arrived in Gardariki, the realm of cities that we know today as Kievan Rus. This is a dimension of Viking history often overlooked in Western accounts. The Norse world did not terminate at the Baltic Sea. It extended all the way to the Black Sea and the gates of Constantinople. In the court of Novgorod, Olaf was welcomed not as a refugee, but as family. The ruler, Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, was his brother-in-law. Surrounded by Byzantine luxuries, warm furs, and the protection of a powerful ally, Olaf could have retired from history. Yaroslav offered him a governor's position in the distant province of Bulgar. Was a comfortable exit. Olaf was in his mid-30s, defeated and exiled. The rational choice was to fade into obscurity and die peacefully in old age. But Olaf was consumed by torment. He spent long nights pacing the halls of Novgorod, wrestling with spiritual crisis. He considered abandoning his crown entirely, traveling to Jerusalem, and living out his days as a monk. Then came the dream. According to the saga traditions, during a restless sleep, a figure of blinding light appeared before Olaf. It was his predecessor, the legendary King Olaf Tryggvason, or perhaps a manifestation of Christ himself. The voice did not offer comfort. It issued a command: return to your kingdom. God has granted it to you, and you will not let lesser men take it. Conquer or die. Olaf awoke with terrifying clarity. Political calculation no longer mattered. The odds no longer mattered. He had become an instrument of divine will. He made one decision that revealed. He knew exactly what awaited him. He left his young son Magnus in the safety of Yaroslav's court. He understood he was marching toward slaughter, and he wanted to ensure his bloodline would survive the fire. With a force of only a few hundred followers, mostly loyalists who had fled with him, supplemented by Swedish adventurers recruited along the way, Olaf turned his back on safety and began the long march across the frozen mountains toward Norway. He was not returning to negotiate. He was returning to claim his throne or his martyrdom. The road back led through the Colan Mountains, the unforgiving spine of Scandinavia. It was early summer 1030 when Olaf descended into Swedish territory and began gathering reinforcements. The Swedish king, Anand Jacob, was an ally, but not a suicidal one. He refused to declare open war against Cnut's empire. Instead, he permitted Olaf to recruit freely within his borders. The resulting force was a congregation of desperate men. Olaf's army numbered approximately 3,600 soldiers. A corps of hardened loyalists formed the vanguard. But the bulk consisted of outlaws, bandits, and mercenaries seeking plunder rather than holy war. In his new religious fervor, Olaf imposed a bizarre requirement on these criminals. They had to be baptized. The sight must have been remarkable. Hardened killers kneeling by freezing rivers to accept Christ so they could earn payment for slaughtering Norwegians. As they crossed into Norway, Olaf ordered a transformation of his forces' appearance. He knew they looked like brigands. He needed them to resemble the army of God. Every man was commanded to paint a white cross on his shield and helmet. He gave them a battle cry that would echo across the valley. Fram, Fram, Christman, Crossman, Kongsman, forward, forward, Christman, Crossman, Kingsman. But the omens were troubling. As the army navigated treacherous mountain paths, Olaf slipped and fell to his knees. In the superstitious mindset of the age, a falling king signified a falling kingdom. His poet Sigvald attempted to reframe the incident. "You did not fall, my king. You took firm hold of the land, but the mood remained fragile." When they descended from the mountains, and the green valleys of Trondelag came into view, the reality became apparent. There were no cheering crowds welcoming their king home. The farms stood silent. Smoke rose from distant chimneys, signaling that the alarm had been raised. The peasant army was waiting. The force assembled at Stiklestad represented the largest military mobilization in Norwegian history to that date. 14,000 men stood ready to destroy their former king. Their organization was a marvel of pre-modern communication. There was no standing army, no military infrastructure. Instead, they used the budstikke, a heavy wooden baton, sometimes shaped like an arrow or axe, spiked with iron. When danger threatened, this token was passed from farm to farm by runners. The law was absolute. If the budstikke arrived at your door, you dropped your tools, seized your weapons, and ran to the assembly point. Ignoring the summons meant outlawry. In the summer of 1030, the budstikke flew across the valleys with extraordinary speed. Leading this massive host were the men Olaf had wronged most grievously. Kalv Arneson was a tragic figure, once Olaf's trusted ally, now standing at the head of the army meant to kill him. Cnut had promised him the title of Jarl, but his motivation was likely more immediate: self-preservation. He knew what Olaf did to those who opposed him. Then there was Hardened. If Olaf was the unstoppable force, Thor was the immovable object. A powerful northern chieftain, he nursed a personal blood feud against the king. Olaf's men had killed his nephew. Thor wanted not politics, but vengeance. According to saga tradition, Thor wore a strange piece of armor into battle that day, a reindeer-skin tunic crafted by Sami sorcerers, enchanted with old magic to turn aside any blade. While Olaf placed his faith in the cross, Thor placed his in the ancient powers of the north. For the common soldiers, farmers standing shoulder to shoulder in the summer heat, the motivation was visceral. They remembered the Christianization campaigns. They remembered the smell of burning, long houses. They knew that if Olaf regained power, he would show no mercy. He would punish their region with fire and execution. On the morning of battle, the contrast was stark. On the upper slopes stood Olaf's 3,600 men, exhausted, hungry, far from home. Below them, flooding the valley floor, stood 14,000 locals, well-fed, fighting on their own land, defending their own families. The Bondetoge raised their banner, bore no cross. It was the symbol of free farmers united against a tyrant. Before the killing began, there was ritual. Olaf addressed his shivering force. He did not promise them gold. He had none. He did not promise them victory. The mathematics made that a lie. He promised them paradise. If you die, he proclaimed, you die for the King of Heaven. Then came the order, Skaldborg. This was the defining formation of Viking warfare. The men compressed their ranks. The front line locked their round wooden shields together, overlapping rim over rim, to create a solid barrier. The second line pressed their shields against the backs of the men in front, bracing them against impact. Spears projected from the gaps like the quills of a hedgehog. It was a human fortress, but a shield wall is only as strong as the nerve of the men holding it, and Olaf's wall was about to be struck by a tsunami. The peasant army did not advance in orderly fashion. They surged. As they closed the distance, they shouted their own war cry, Fram, Fram, Bondermen. Forward, forward, farmers. The collision was physics at its most brutal. When 14,000 bodies crashed into 3,000, the front ranks of both sides were crushed by the pressure of men pushing from behind. Ribs cracked, lungs collapsed. Men who lost their footing were trampled into bloody paste. For the first hour, discipline held. Olaf's mercenaries were professional killers. They understood the mechanics of shield wall combat. Deflect the axe blow with the shield boss. Stab the spear into the exposed groin or throat. Step back. Reset. Read. But efficiency has limits. The Bondetoge possessed an endless reservoir of bodies. For every farmer Olaf's men killed, fresh fighters stepped over the corpse, hacking at the splintering shields. Round midday, the sky began to change. The sun, which had been bright on the snow-capped peaks, started to dim. The total solar eclipse was beginning. A sickly twilight washed across the battlefield. In the confusion, command structure dissolved. The shield wall fragmented into thousands of individual combats. Olaf realized he could no longer direct the battle from the rear. The center was collapsing. He drew his sword, a weapon named Nightier, and stepped beyond the protection of his bodyguards. He was no longer fighting as a general. He was fighting as a berserker. He cut his way toward the enemy banners, searching for the rebel leaders. He wanted to decapitate the serpent. Through the gloom, he spotted them. Kalv Arnesson and Thor Hund. They were not hiding. They were waiting. The king charged into the trap. In the center of the slaughter, the air thick with iron, and the stench of opened bodies, King Olaf finally reached Thorhund. This was the confrontation the saga poets had anticipated. It was not merely combat. It was a test of faith against sorcery. Olaf swung Nightire with both hands, aiming a killing stroke at Thor's shoulder. The blade should have cleaved the chieftain in half. Instead, it bounced away, as if striking stone. No blood appeared. Thor was wearing his enchanted reindeer tunic. To the superstitious minds watching in the eclipse darkness, this was a sign from powers beyond human understanding. The king's holy sword had failed. Strike the dog down. Olaf screamed to his marshal, beat him with a club, if steel will not work. But it was too late. The king had overextended. The wolves were closing. The first wound came not from a noble warrior, but from a commoner, Thorstein Narazimed, a shipbuilder loyal to the rebels, swung a heavy woodcutting axe. It bit deep into Olaf's left leg, just above the knee. The king crumbled. This was not a hero's injury, was a hamstringing. Olaf collapsed against a large boulder, unable to stand, forced to look up at his executioners. The second blow came from Thorhund. Seeing the king helpless, the chieftain did not hesitate. He drove his spear through Olaf's abdomen, pinning him against the stone. It was a gut wound, agonizing, messy, and inevitably fatal. The final blow was delivered by the man whose betrayal cut deepest. Kalv Arneson, the former friend, the former ally, stepped forward. He raised his sword and struck the left side of Olaf's neck. Leg, belly, neck. 3 wounds. 3 betrayers. With that final stroke, the self-proclaimed eternal King of Norway went still. His blood soaked into the moss of the Stiklestad valley. And at that precise moment, as if choreographed by forces beyond human comprehension, the solar eclipse reached totality. The world went completely black. In the movies, when the antagonist dies, the story ends. History follows different rules. At Stiklestad, the peasant army won the battle, but Olaf Haraldsson won the war. He accomplished this while being dead. In the immediate aftermath, Olaf's corpse was hidden in a farmer's shed. The victors expected normality to return. They expected their old freedoms to be restored. Instead, they received something far worse. The new Danish administrators installed by Cnut imposed crushing taxes and harsh regulations that exceeded anything Olaf had attempted. The very farmers who had hacked the king to pieces began to remember his reign with increasing nostalgia. Then the rumors began. Blind men claimed they rubbed their eyes with Olaf's blood and regained their sight. Locals reported strange lights hovering over his unmarked grave. 1 year after the battle, in 1031, Bishop Grimkel received permission to exhume the body. Everyone expected to find decomposed remains. What they discovered shocked them. According to contemporary accounts, Olaf appeared as if merely sleeping. His skin retained healthy color. His hair and fingernails had continued growing. Instead of the stench of decay, the grave emitted the fragrance of roses. The transformation was instantaneous. The tyrant was reborn as the martyr. The brutal king became Saint Olaf. Even his killer Thorhund was swept into the religious fervor. According to legend, the hard-bitten chieftain, overwhelmed by guilt and awe, abandoned Norway entirely. He walked barefoot to Jerusalem as penance and never returned. Olaf's son Magnus returned from Russia to reclaim the throne, welcomed by the same population that had driven his father into exile. Norway finally achieved the unity that Olaf had failed to impose through violence, united now by his ghost. Today, the Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, the northernmost medieval cathedral in the world, stands over his burial site. It became the most important pilgrimage destination in northern Europe for centuries. Olaf Haraldsson was a brutal man. He was a Viking raider, a torture-dispensing warlord, and a power-obsessed politician. But history is rarely written by the gentle. It is written by the survivors who require symbols to hold nations together. Olaf failed to conquer Norway when 14,000 peasants stood against him. But as a saint, he conquered their hearts and minds for eternity. He became the Rex Perpetuus Norvegii, the eternal king of Norway. The lesson of Stiklestad endures across 1,000 years. You can kill a man. You can pierce his leg, his belly, and his neck. You can watch his blood drain into the soil. Subscribe to Narrate Hist Arena. Here we'll tell and teach history as it is. But you cannot kill a myth